The town sat quietly in the middle of a wide, dusty plain, surrounded by dry land that seemed to stretch forever. From a distance, it looked like any other small Wild West settlement, with wooden buildings, a single dirt road, and a few tired horses tied outside the saloon. The sun rose and set without hurry, and the wind carried dust through the streets as if time itself had slowed down. To strangers, the town appeared calm and harmless, a place where nothing important ever happened. But those who lived there knew better. Beneath the silence was a past soaked in fear, lies, and unspoken pain that refused to disappear. The people of the town moved carefully, always watching, always listening. They spoke politely during the day but avoided long conversations. At night, doors were locked early, lamps were kept low, and windows stayed shut. No one laughed too loudly, and no one asked too many questions. It was not because they were unfriendly, but because they had learned a hard lesson long ago. In this town, curiosity could lead to trouble, and truth could get a man killed. Everyone knew the rules, even if no one ever said them out loud. At the center of town stood the sheriff's office, a solid building with a faded star nailed to the door. The sheriff was a strong man with cold eyes and a voice that demanded respect. He claimed to keep the peace, and on the surface, the town obeyed him without question. But behind closed doors, people whispered that the law in this town served only a few powerful men. The sheriff was not alone in this. The town council, the saloon owner, and a few rich landholders all shared the same secrets. Together, they controlled the town like invisible chains around every soul who lived there. Long ago, something terrible had happened, something so dark that the town chose to bury it instead of facing it. A group of men had disappeared without a trace, and their families were forced to leave or stay silent. The land they once owned now belonged to others, taken through lies and false papers. Anyone who tried to speak up was warned once. Those who ignored the warning were never seen again. Over time, the town learned to forget, or at least pretend to forget. Silence became the price of survival. One hot afternoon, two travelers rode into town, unaware of the danger hidden beneath its calm surface. Their clothes were dusty, and their faces showed the wear of long days on the trail. They were not outlaws or troublemakers, just ordinary men looking for rest, food, and fresh horses. As they entered the town, they noticed the strange quiet. The way people stopped talking when they passed, the way eyes followed them from behind half-closed doors. It felt wrong, but they brushed it aside, thinking it was just another unfriendly frontier town. They stopped at the saloon, the only place that seemed alive. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and tension. A few men sat at tables, nursing drinks and watching the newcomers without smiling. The bartender spoke little, answering questions with short words and nervous glances toward the door. As the travelers ate and drank, they overheard fragments of hushed conversations. Names were mentioned, then quickly silenced. A few words about land, gold, and dead men drifted through the room, before disappearing into uneasy laughter. That night, one of the travelers stepped outside for fresh air and accidentally heard something he was never meant to hear. Two men stood in the shadows behind the saloon, arguing in low voices. They spoke of stolen land, forged papers, and men who had been taken care of. The traveler froze, his heart pounding, as the truth slowly formed in his mind. This town was built on blood and lies, and the people in charge would do anything to protect their secret. The next morning, the travelers planned to leave early, but it was already too late. The town seemed different now, heavier, as if it knew it had been seen. The sheriff watched them closely, his cold eyes following every move. The townsfolk avoided them completely, fear written clearly on their faces. Without meaning to, the travelers had stepped into a story that was never meant to be told. They did not yet understand how dangerous their knowledge was, or how far the town would go to keep its past buried. But one thing was clear. In this quiet town with a dark past, knowing the truth was the most dangerous thing of all. The truth did not reveal itself all at once. It came slowly, like a shadow stretching across the ground as the sun moved higher. After spending the night in the strange and silent town, the two travelers began to sense that something was deeply wrong. Every sound felt louder, every look heavier. The calm of the place now felt false, like a mask hiding something dangerous underneath. They did not come searching for trouble, but trouble had already found them. Early that morning, one of the travelers went to the stable to check on the horses. The stable owner, an old man with shaking hands and tired eyes, avoided his gaze. When asked simple questions, he answered with fear in his voice. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if someone was always listening. As the traveler prepared to leave, he noticed a loose floorboard near the back of the stable. Beneath it lay a bundle of old papers wrapped in cloth. At first he meant to ignore it, but something told him to look closer. The papers told a story the town wanted buried forever. They showed land ownership records with false signatures and dates that did not match. Names of men long gone appeared again and again, written over and crossed out. Some pages were stained, as if by old blood or rain. The traveler felt his hands tremble as he realized what he was holding. These papers were proof that land had been stolen and lives destroyed to hide the truth. The stable owner begged him to put the papers back, his voice breaking as he spoke. He warned that knowing too much would only bring death. Later that day, the two travelers met near the edge of town and shared what they had learned. Together, they began to understand the deadly secret. The town's leaders had taken land rich with hidden gold. Anyone who discovered the truth was framed, hanged, or forced to disappear. The lawmen were not protectors, but guards of a lie. The travelers were now part of the secret, and there was no escape from it. As they walked through town, they noticed signs they had missed before. Empty homes stood abandoned, their doors swinging in the wind. Graves without names lay behind the church, marked only by rough wooden crosses. Mothers pulled their children inside when the travelers passed, fear stronger than kindness. The town was not quiet because it was peaceful. It was quiet because it was afraid. That evening, one of the travelers decided to speak to a woman who ran the small boarding house. She had kind eyes but a face worn by grief. At first, she refused to talk, but when the traveler mentioned the stolen land, her hands began to shake. She whispered that her husband had been one of the men who tried to tell the truth years ago. He had been accused of theft and hanged in the town square before sunrise. No trial, no proof, only lies. Her story was one of many. As night fell, the travelers learned of more innocent men who had died for the same reason. Others vanished into the desert. Their land, their gold, and their names were erased. The deadly secret was not just about land or money. It was about power, fear, and a town built on silence. The travelers knew they should leave immediately, but fear held them in place. Leaving without speaking felt wrong, yet staying meant risking their lives. The weight of the truth pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. Every shadow looked like a threat, unseen by them. Eyes followed their movements. The sheriff had already heard whispers of questions being asked. He knew the signs. Outsiders who asked about the past never stayed long. He met with the town's powerful men that night, their voices low and angry. The secret had survived for years, and they would not allow two strangers to destroy it now. By the time the moon rose high over the town, the travelers understood the danger they were in. They had learned a truth that demanded blood to protect it. In this town, secrets were guarded with rope and guns, not words. They had uncovered the deadly secret, and the town would soon make sure they paid the price for knowing it. By the third day, the town no longer bothered to hide its hostility. The air felt tense, as if a storm was waiting to break. The two travelers could feel it in every step they took, and every glance thrown their way. What had once seemed like quiet curiosity had turned into open suspicion. People no longer whispered when they passed. Instead, they went silent, watching with hard eyes. The travelers knew then that the truth they carried was no longer a secret. That morning, the sheriff called them into his office. The building smelled of dust, old paper, and fear. The sheriff sat behind his desk, his badge catching the light, his expression calm but dangerous. He asked simple questions at first: where they came from, where they were going, how long they planned to stay. His voice was smooth, but his eyes never blinked. The travelers answered carefully, knowing every word mattered. Then the questions changed. The sheriff asked about the stable, the boarding house, and the people they had spoken to. He mentioned the old land records, pretending it was only a rumor. The travelers understood then that the sheriff already knew. This was not an investigation. It was a warning. When they denied knowing anything, the sheriff leaned back and smiled slightly. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had already decided their fate. By noon, deputies surrounded the travelers in the street. Without explanation, they were grabbed, searched, and dragged toward the jail. The townspeople watched from doorways and windows. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. Fear had taken away their voices long ago. The travelers shouted that they had done nothing wrong, but their words disappeared into the dry air. The charges were read quickly, and without proof: theft, trespassing, conspiracy, crimes that sounded serious enough to justify any punishment. The sheriff claimed they were dangerous men spreading lies to steal land. The town council agreed without question. There would be no trial. There never was in this town. Justice, like truth, had already been decided. Inside the jail, the travelers sat in separate cells, the bars cold and unforgiving. The walls were marked with old scratches and broken messages left by men who never walked free again. One traveler found a name carved into the stone, followed by a date from years ago. It ended with a single word: innocent. That word stayed with him, heavy and painful. Outside, the sheriff met with the powerful men of the town. They spoke of protecting what was theirs and keeping order. They told themselves they were doing what was necessary. Killing the travelers would silence the secret once and for all. Fear had ruled this town for too long to allow mercy now. As the sun lowered, the sound of hammers echoed through the square. The gallows were being built again. The same structure used many times before, though few dared remember it. The rope was tested, strong and ready. Some townspeople turned away, unable to watch, but none dared interfere. Word spread quickly, though quietly. By nightfall, everyone knew what was coming. The boarding house woman cried alone in her room, remembering her husband's final moments. The stable owner drank himself into silence. The town's children were kept indoors, taught once again that survival meant obedience. In their cells, the travelers heard the sounds of preparation. Each strike of wood felt like a countdown. Fear filled their chests, but anger burned just as strong. They had done nothing wrong except learn the truth. One of them whispered a prayer. The other promised that if he survived, the town would never forget what it had done. Late that night, the sheriff returned to the jail. He stood between the cells, his shadow stretching across the floor. He told them there would be no sunrise for them. Their deaths would be quick, and the town would move on as it always did. He turned and walked away, leaving silence behind him. As darkness settled over the town, the travelers understood the cruel rule of the Wild West. When the law served lies, innocence meant nothing. The gallows were not waiting for criminals. They were waiting for the truth. Dawn arrived slowly, dragging light across the town like a heavy burden. The sky was pale and colorless, as if even the sun did not wish to witness what was about to happen. The town square stood quiet, but not peaceful. In the center, The gallows rose tall and dark, its rough wood still fresh from the night before. The rope hung stiff and ready, moving slightly in the morning wind. It had been prepared with care, not for justice, but for silence. The townspeople began to gather one by one. Some came out of fear, others out of duty, and a few out of cruel curiosity. No one spoke louder than a whisper. Boots scraped against the dirt, and horses stamped the ground nervously. Windows stayed half closed, as if the buildings themselves wished to look away. Children were kept indoors, told to stay quiet and not ask questions. This was not the first hanging the town had seen, but it never became easier to watch. The sheriff stood near the gallows, calm and confident. His deputies formed a line, rifles resting against their shoulders. To anyone passing through, it would have looked like order and control. But beneath it all was fear, thick and heavy. The sheriff knew that if even one voice spoke the truth today, everything would fall apart. The hangings were not only punishment, they were a warning. The jail door opened, and the two prisoners were led into the square. Their hands were tied, and their faces showed the weight of sleepless nights. Dust clung to their clothes and dried. Blood marked where they had been beaten. Yet their eyes were clear. They looked around the crowd, searching for a single face willing to stand with them. They found none. The silence cut deeper than the rope ever could. As they were placed beneath the gallows, memories rushed through their minds. The roads they had traveled, the people they had met, the simple mistake of asking the wrong questions. One traveler noticed the old marks carved into the wooden steps of the gallows. Names scratched out, dates faded by time. He realized how many others had stood in this same place, accused, forgotten, and erased. The sheriff began to read the charges. His voice was loud and steady, carrying across the square. Theft, lies, threats to peace. Each word was a lie, but spoken with such confidence that it almost sounded real. The crowd listened in silence, heads lowered. A few people clenched their fists, but fear kept them still. Speaking now would mean joining the men on the platform. A deputy placed the nooses around the prisoners' necks. The rope was rough and cold. One traveler swallowed hard, his throat burning with fear. The other lifted his head and looked straight at the sheriff. In a clear voice, he spoke the truth. He told the crowd about the stolen land, the false papers, and the innocent men who had died. His words echoed through the square, sharp and powerful. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The crowd shifted. Some looked up, eyes wide with shock and guilt. The sheriff's face darkened with anger. He shouted for silence, ordering the deputy to prepare the drop. The truth had been spoken, and it terrified him more than any gun. The travelers were given a final chance to speak. One said nothing, choosing dignity over pleading. The other spoke softly, not in anger, but in sadness. He told the town that fear had ruled them for too long. That silence had cost innocent lives. His voice cracked, but he did not beg. The executioner stepped forward, hand on the lever. The rope tightened. The wind carried the sound of breathing, slow and heavy. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman began to cry, but quickly covered her mouth. The sheriff raised his hand, ready to give the signal. At that very moment, the sound of hooves thundered across the ground. Heads turned. Dust rose at the edge of the square as a rider came into view, riding hard and fast. The sheriff froze, anger flashing in his eyes. The crowd stirred, unsure whether to hope or fear what was coming. The gallows stood ready, death only seconds away. But fate had not finished writing the story yet. Far beyond the edge of the town, where the land opened into wide fields and scattered hills, lived a rancher who kept mostly to himself. His ranch sat alone under the open sky, surrounded by fences worn smooth by time and weather. He was not a man who looked for trouble, nor one who enjoyed attention. He worked from sunrise to sunset, caring for his cattle and his land, and at night he slept with the calm of someone who had learned to trust silence. But this rancher knew something. The town hoped would stay buried forever. Years ago, before fear ruled the streets, the rancher had been a witness to the town's darkest act. He had seen how powerful men forged papers and claimed land that did not belong to them. He had watched honest men speak up, only to be crushed by lies and false charges. One of those men had been his closest friend, a quiet farmer who believed the law would protect him. Instead, the rancher had stood in the crowd as his friend was hanged, unable to move, unable to speak, haunted by the weight of his silence. That moment changed him forever. He left the town soon after, not out of guilt alone, but out of survival. He took his family and settled far away, choosing distance over danger. Still, the past followed him. Every time he rode near the town, the memories returned. He knew the secret had never died. It had only been hidden, protected by fear and blood. On the morning of the hanging, the rancher heard the news from a passing rider. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. Two strangers were about to die. For the same lie, the same crime of knowing too much. For a moment, he stood still, staring at the horizon, feeling the familiar pull of fear telling him to stay away. He had stayed silent once before, and it had cost a man his life. This time, he made a different choice. The rancher went inside his house and opened an old wooden chest hidden beneath the floor. Inside were papers wrapped carefully in cloth, yellowed with age but still clear. They were copies of land records, signed statements, and names of the men who had planned everything. Proof he had kept all these years, waiting for a moment that might never come. His hands shook as he touched the papers, knowing that carrying them into town meant risking everything. He saddled his horse without delay. The animal sensed urgency and stamped the ground as if it understood the danger ahead. The rancher rode hard, dust rising behind him as the sun climbed higher. Each mile brought him closer to the town he had tried to forget and the truth he could no longer ignore. As he rode, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the sound of the rope tightening, the silence of the crowd, and the look in his friend's eyes just before the drop. That memory burned, stronger than fear. He knew that if he turned back now, he would carry that shame for the rest of his life. The rancher also knew the power of the men he was riding to face. They controlled the law, the guns, and the town itself. They would not hesitate to kill him to protect their secret. Still, he pressed on. Some truths demanded a price, and he was ready to pay it. When the town came into view, the sound of voices carried across the land. He could see the crowd gathered in the square, the dark shape of the gallows standing like a warning. His heart pounded as he urged his horse faster. He did not know if he would arrive in time. He only knew he had to try. The rancher was no hero. By nature, he was simply a man who had lived too long with regret. Today, he chose courage over fear, truth over silence. And with every beat of his horse's hooves, the fate of innocent men drew closer to change. The sound of pounding hooves cut through the heavy silence of the town square like a sudden crack of thunder. Dust rose into the air as the rancher burst into view, riding straight toward the gallows without slowing. The crowd gasped and turned, startled by the sudden interruption. For a brief moment, confusion spread through the square, and that moment was enough to change everything. The sheriff shouted for the rider to stop, his voice sharp with anger. Deputies raised their rifles, unsure whether to fire or wait for orders. The rancher did not stop. He rode closer, his eyes locked on the platform where the two prisoners stood with ropes around their necks. He could see their faces clearly, now fear mixed with defiance, and it strengthened his resolve. Just feet from the gallows, the rancher pulled hard on the reins. His horse reared slightly, and dust settled around him as he dismounted. The rancher raised one hand and called out in a strong, steady voice. He told the sheriff to stop the execution at once. His confidence shocked the crowd. No one spoke to the sheriff like that and lived. The sheriff stepped forward, his face red with rage. He accused the rancher of interfering with the law and ordered his deputies to arrest him, but the rancher did not back away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle of old papers, holding them high for everyone to see. The murmuring crowd grew louder. Papers meant proof, and proof was something the sheriff feared. The rancher spoke clearly, making sure every word carried. Across the square, he explained how the land had been stolen years ago, how false records were made, and how innocent men were hanged to protect a lie. He named names. He pointed at the town leaders standing nearby and accused them of murder and theft. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the truth spilled out into the open. The sheriff shouted again, calling the rancher a liar, but his voice no longer held the same power. The crowd had heard this story before, whispered in fear, but never spoken aloud. Now it stood in the open, impossible to ignore. Some townspeople stepped forward, eyes filled with anger and shame. Others backed away, afraid of what would happen next. A deputy moved toward the lever, ready to end the prisoners' lives before the truth could spread further. Seeing this, the rancher reached for his gun. He did not fire, but the message was clear. If the execution continued, blood would follow. The square fell into tense silence, every breath held. The sheriff realized he was losing control. He ordered the rancher to be shot, but no one moved. The deputies looked at the crowd, then at the papers, then at the prisoners. Fear had ruled them for years, but now doubt crept in. Doubt was dangerous to men who lived on lies. One of the older townsmen stepped forward and spoke. He confirmed the rancher's story, his voice shaking as he admitted his role in staying silent. Another followed, then another. Each confession added weight to the truth. The secret that had survived for so long began to crumble under the light of day. The sheriff reached for his gun, desperation in his eyes. Before he could draw, one of the deputies stopped him. A struggle followed, quick and violent. The sheriff fell to the ground, disarmed and defeated. The crowd watched in stunned silence as years of fear collapsed in a single moment. The ropes were cut. The prisoners collapsed to their knees, gasping for air, alive by seconds. Relief washed over the square, mixed with shock and disbelief. The gallows stood empty, its purpose stolen away by courage and truth. The rancher looked at the freed men, then at the town. He knew the fight was not fully over, but the hardest part had been won. The lie was broken. And in that moment, the Wild West witnessed something rare. Justice born from bravery. The sound of pounding hooves cut through the heavy silence of the town square, like a sudden crack of thunder. Dust rose into the air as the rancher burst into view, riding straight toward the gallows without slowing. The crowd gasped and turned in surprise, their eyes following the lone rider who dared to interrupt an execution. For a brief moment, confusion spread through the square, and that single moment was enough to change everything. The sheriff shouted for the rider to stop, his voice sharp with anger and fear. Deputies lifted their rifles, unsure whether to fire or wait for orders. The rancher did not slow. His horse thundered closer, and his eyes stayed locked on the platform where the two prisoners stood with ropes tight around their necks. He could see their faces clearly, now tired, bruised, but still unbroken. That sight pushed him forward. Just a few steps from the gallows, the rancher pulled hard on the reins. The horse reared and came to a stop as dust settled around them. The rancher jumped down, boots hitting the ground with force. He raised his voice and demanded the execution. "Stop at once." The strength in his voice shocked the crowd. No one spoke to the sheriff that way, not in this town. The sheriff stepped forward, his face burning with rage. He called the rancher a criminal and ordered the deputies to arrest him. But the rancher did not move. Instead, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a thick bundle of old papers tied with worn string. He held them high so everyone could see. A low murmur rolled through the crowd. Papers meant proof, and proof meant danger for those in power. The rancher began to speak, slow and clear. He told the town how land had been stolen through fake records and lies. He explained how innocent men were framed, jailed, and hanged to keep the truth hidden. He spoke of names, dates, and signatures written in blood and fear. Then he pointed directly at the sheriff and the men standing beside him and accused them of murder. Gasps filled the square. The sheriff shouted back, calling the rancher a liar. But his voice no longer carried strength. The crowd had heard these stories before in whispers, but never out loud, never in daylight. The truth felt heavy, but it felt real. One deputy stepped toward the lever, desperate to end the hanging before the crowd turned. The rancher noticed and placed his hand near his gun. He did not draw it, but his message was clear. If the lever was pulled, blood would spill. The square fell into a tense silence where even breathing felt dangerous. The sheriff screamed orders, but none were followed. The deputies looked uncertain. Years of fear had taught them to obey, but doubt now stood between them and their duty. Doubt was powerful, and it spread fast. An old man stepped forward from the crowd, his shoulders shaking. He admitted he had seen the false papers years ago. A woman followed, crying as she spoke of her husband's death. One by one, voices rose. The truth, once buried deep, now stood fully exposed. The sheriff reached for his gun, panic in his eyes. Before he could pull it free, a deputy grabbed his arm. They struggled, fell, and the sheriff was disarmed. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the man who ruled them with fear finally lost control. The ropes were cut. The prisoners dropped to their knees, coughing, alive by seconds. The gallows stood empty, useless at last. Relief and shock swept through the square like a wave. The rancher looked at the freed men, then at the broken faces of the town. The lie was finished, and for the first time in years, justice stood in. The town did not know how to breathe once the truth stood fully exposed. The square, once silent with fear, now buzzed with confusion and shock. People looked at one another as if waking from a long nightmare, unsure of what came next. The gallows still stood in the center, but its power was gone. The rope hung loose, no longer a symbol of control, but of shame. The freed prisoners were helped to their feet by the rancher and a few brave townsmen. Their legs shook not only from fear, but from the sudden return of life. They had been seconds from death, and now the sun shone on them as if nothing had happened. One of them looked at the crowd and saw faces filled with regret. He did not speak. Words felt too small for what he had endured. The sheriff lay on the ground, disarmed and surrounded. Without his gun and badge, he looked smaller, weaker, like any other man. Years of power had vanished in moments. The deputies stood uncertain, caught between loyalty and truth. Slowly, one of them stepped forward and placed the sheriff in chains. It was a simple act, but it shook the town to its core. The law had finally turned on itself. The town council tried to speak, to explain, to protect themselves. They claimed they had done what was needed to keep order. But their words fell flat. The papers the rancher held told a clearer story. Land deeds, false signatures, and written confessions could not be argued away. The people had seen enough. Lies no longer felt safe. As the crowd grew bolder, more voices rose. A farmer spoke of land taken from his family. A widow spoke of her husband's hanging. Each story added weight to the truth. The secret that had lived in shadows for years now stood fully revealed under the open sky. The prisoners were given water and blankets. Their injuries were treated as best as possible. Every small act of kindness felt new, almost strange, after years of fear. The rancher watched quietly, knowing the danger had not fully passed. Men who lose power rarely accept it peacefully. By sunset, word had spread beyond the town. Riders were sent to nearby settlements, carrying news of corruption and murder. This time, the truth traveled faster than fear. Other sheriffs, judges, and lawmen would soon hear what had happened. The town could no longer hide behind silence. That night, the sheriff and the council members were locked in the same jail they once controlled. The sound of the cell door closing echoed through the streets like justice finally arriving. Some townspeople stood outside, not cheering, but watching in quiet reflection. They were not celebrating revenge. They were witnessing balance return. The rancher prepared to leave before dawn. He had done what he came to do. Staying longer would only bring danger. Before he left, the freedmen thanked him, their voices heavy with gratitude. He told them the truth had saved them, not him. Courage, he believed, belonged to anyone willing to speak when silence felt safer. As the sun rose again, the town felt different. The air was lighter. People spoke openly for the first time in years. Fear had loosened its grip. The gallows would soon be torn down, its wood burned and forgotten. Justice had not come easily, but it had come at last. And the Wild West, for once, remembered the innocent.